This is the first in a series of videos I'll be doing exploring a book by Leonid Perlovsky called Music, Passion, and Cognitive Function. This video is showcasing mostly his work and the work he collected from other researchers in multiple fields. I'm merely explaining what he states. Perlovsky's work is greatly influential on how I conceive music, and I've wanted to share this passion and understanding with you for a while now. But I was afraid I'd be insufficient and not be able to do the subject justice. Frankly, I still might be. If this is a subject you've researched or read thoroughly about, I'd love to hear from you. I'm very excited to read these comments. And because I'll be using Perlovsky's book as a framework for this video series, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of Music, Passion, and Cognitive Function. I'll have a link to that in the description so you can get it yourself. At very least, it would be great to get a copy just to support the man for the work that he's done in this field, but also to enrich yourself on your own musical journey. Okay, let's get into it. I guess if we're going to talk about someone's theory, we should probably know a little bit about the man. Leonid Perlovsky is a renowned neuroscientist whose work involves cognitive algorithms and modeling of evolution of languages and cultures. That ChatGPT website you're using to help craft a better email or to help you write a better essay for an assignment, or that ChatGPT that I'm using to help me write this script, Perlovsky's research contributed to its development. But more relevant to this channel, Perlovsky has a passion for music, and some of his work explores how music affects the mind or is perceived by the mind, the cognitive function of music. Perlovsky has developed a radical theory that needs more testing and research, and in my opinion, much more attention. But I'm convinced there's a substantial level of truth in the claims and analysis of his research. His theory depends upon the work of multiple disciplines, including psychology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology. When multiple disciplines intersect on a singular finding, you're likely to be on the path to truth. Perlovsky claims that music is an ability evolved to resolve cognitive dissonances. When proto-man evolved into Homo sapien as we know him today, our ability to collect information became so powerful, the volume of information was so high, more powerful than any species on Earth, that we needed to evolve the ability of music as an adaptation to compensate. He acknowledges this is not the only utility of music, but that it's a fundamental part of understanding the meaning of music, why it's so important to individuals and cultures, and why it's ubiquitous across every culture. Is this getting a little hard to follow? Well, over this series of videos, we'll untangle this theory as best we can. We'll go through the theories that contribute to it from evolution and psychology, and we'll look at Perlovsky's work that confirms his theory. But before we get there, we should take some time to appreciate why this research is even necessary. It's just music, you may say. It's not that important. Considering the day and age we live in, I can understand that reaction. But music has been a powerful mystery since the dawn of time, one that man has been searching to better understand since the ancient Greeks, and still to this day, can't quite wrap its mind around. Music. Vocal or instrumental sounds, or both, combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion. This is the literal definition of music. It lists some mechanics of music and how it's applied. We've spent millennia studying the science of music, melody, rhythm, harmony, timbre, dynamic, frequencies, saturation, compression, stereo field. But with all the scientific strides we've made in understanding the technical aspects of music, man still struggles to answer some fundamental questions we've had since the beginning of time. How is it that music can, without words, evoke our laughter, our fears, our highest aspirations? Jane Swan. She's taking time to behold the wonder of music, and it's a marvelous sentiment. The mystery that is music. Music is so exceedingly available today and used in so many circumstances that it's easy for us to take music for granted as this surface-level pleasing sound. We're constantly surrounded by it to the point we don't even realize we're being affected by it. But if you take the time to just stop and listen, pay attention to your body, pay attention to your brain, you can start to notice a feeling come over you. Your mindset subtly changes. Maybe your head bobs or your foot taps. Maybe you sway back and forth. Maybe you start quietly humming or singing along without even realizing you're doing it. Maybe you enjoy that meal at the restaurant just slightly more and feel more inclined to come back again. Maybe you decide to buy that extra bag of chips at the checkout of the grocery. Music touches something deep within the human consciousness that's hard for us to define. We don't know exactly what part of the psyche is being touched, how it controls us, or why we have this amazing ability. Its mystery begins to border on the mystical, the spiritual. Music can begin to look something like a spiritual force, or even God. We know music is truly there. We hear it, we make it, we feel its effects, we can experience it. We know how it's made, yet it's still a mystery as to how and why it has such power over the human psyche. Examining the mystery of music and the almost spiritual experience we have with it draws several religious parallels. A fundamental part of Judeo-Christian theology is God as mystery, something we chase and yearn for, though our minds cannot grasp infinity. God cannot be grasped by the mind. If he could be grasped, he would not be God. Evagrius Ponticus. The mystery of God hugs you in its all-encompassing arms. Hildegard von Bingen. Even the ancient mystery religions, such as the Eleusinian Mysteries cult, attempted to revere and hold sacred the mystery of the spiritual, to the point of keeping it secret behind initiation ceremonies. Existence as mystery has been a powerful guiding force of spirituality, philosophy, and culture since the beginning of history. And funny enough, so has music. But that's just music and God as mysteries. There are even more spiritual parallels between the two. For instance, the only truth is music. Jack Kerouac. Jews and Christians profess God is their one true God, the source of truth, truth itself. Music was my refuge. I could crawl into the space between the notes and curl my back to loneliness. Maya Angelou. There are countless psalms in the Bible expressing desire to seek refuge in God. There are so many comparisons to be made between spiritual and musical experiences. It's no wonder music has been considered spiritually and religiously potent. When you allow yourself to just listen to and appreciate the music itself outside of other senses, there can be a profoundness that one could interpret as touching God. I encourage you all to listen to ancient chant from across multiple cultures: Gregorian chant, Orthodox Christian chant, Hebrew chant, Muslim chant, Buddhist chant, Shinto chant. When you do it in a time and place where you set the distractions aside and you can close your eyes for a moment. And I think you'll understand what I mean. Since our earliest days, people have used music as a way of connecting with the divine through aesthetic and beauty. Connecting to the sublime in a real experience that still seems ever elusive before us. Music can feel like our gateway to elevated being, and we still have no good explanation for it. To this day, music baffles philosophers and scientists alike. Aristotle, Kant, Darwin, three vastly different thinkers with rigorously formulated ideas, some of the most respected and influential thinkers of all time. One of the fundamental human experiences they couldn't find a proper answer for was music. Aristotle regarded the mystery of why music affects our emotions as profoundly as trying to understand the existence of God and the finiteness of the world. Kant merely gave up trying to identify the magic of music, saying music was the lowest of the beautiful arts because it merely plays with the senses. Darwin tried to explain everything through his theory of evolution, but could not find a satisfactory answer for music, even by his own judgment. Because evolution can't easily explain music's role, some evolutionary psychologists like Steven Pinker have sided more with Kant, saying music is auditory cheesecake and that it merely tickles sensitive spots by a happy accident. Scientists across disciplines can't seem to answer music's most basic mystery, but acknowledge music is a universal across all cultures. And whether you're studying culture or science, or just experiencing it in your daily life, everyone seems to understand music's ubiquity. Music is the universal language of mankind. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Music is the shorthand of emotion. Leo Tolstoy. Emotion. This seems to be a key to unlocking the secrets of the power of music. I'll be covering music and emotion more in depth in a later video, but I wanted to take a moment to emphasize the importance of music and emotion. Fundamentally, music is sound. It's a form of communication. We don't typically think about music as communication, but let's consider what communication is. Communication, the imparting or exchanging of information. There's a universally accepted theory of communication, and the basics of this theory are: there is a sender who has a message that he wants to send. That message is transmitted through a medium to a receiver. Finally, that receiver interprets the message. There's more to this theory, but for our purposes today, let's focus on the bare basics. Music is a form of information. It can be recorded, transmitted, and interpreted by someone else. The Music Studio, a lesson academy in Toronto, Canada, sums it up quite nicely. Music has been used to communicate in a variety of different ways all across human history and culture. It's one of our oldest and most universal forms of communication, thanks in part to the fact that we all feel the same emotions and can identify them in music from other cultures. So the medium of music is vibrations through air or sound. The sender is the musician, the composer. The receiver is the audience. So what exactly is the message? Well, the music itself, or emotional information. Information that resonates emotionally with us outside the context of definitions and semantics. Music is made to connect people emotionally, like many forms of art. The fundamental difference being, music does not deal in concepts as a medium, merely undefinable sound that we find meaning in. By undefinable, I mean you couldn't write a dictionary definition of Beethoven's Fifth, yet we have the capability of understanding it just by experiencing it. Some might say music is a language. If we go back to our Longfellow quote, music is the universal language of mankind. While it's a good quote with a nice sentiment, Perlovsky actually takes great pains to emphasize the difference between music and language. Music communicates emotional information. Language communicates semantic information. Language operates in defined concepts. Music operates in the semantically ambiguous. There will be a whole video explaining why this idea is important, so I won't go any further into this now. But before we proceed to the next section, I wanted to emphasize, music is communication, but not language. Music communicates emotion. While language can take on musical properties to infuse emotional context, and music can take on semantic properties to enhance the emotional response, fundamentally, they are different in this way. To better illustrate how important and alluring the search for the purpose of music was throughout history, let's look at some of the foundational theories that brought us to our current understanding today. In ancient Greece, Pythagoras and his music of the spheres found much more significance for music than the auditory cheesecake of Steven Pinker. Pythagoras' concept of music of the spheres suggests that there's a special kind of music made by the patterns in the universe. The patterns and fabric of existence themselves made music. At least that's what Pythagoras believed. Think of it like how everything from numbers to shapes and even sounds fit together in perfect balance. Pythagoras perceived that as harmonious. He even believed that planets, including the sun and the moon, each had their own unique sound, even though we can't hear them. And these celestial sounds, he thought, affect life on Earth. Weirdly enough, all things technically do vibrate, including the Earth. In 1952, the Schumann resonance was discovered, which is the fundamental frequency of Earth that resonates with all life on the planet and actually impacts the health of all life on the planet. It's not quite the idea Pythagoras was getting at, but it's interesting how Pythagoras' intuition and reason brought him within a stone's throw of truth, with the fraction of the technological advancement. About a century later, Plato would say that studying the stars and music were parallel, saying, "We use our eyes for stars and our ears for music, but both need an understanding of patterns and balance." Many prominent ancient Greek thinkers believed that human emotions were vulnerable to pitfalls, and the right kind of music could help balance those feelings with clear thinking or reason. Plato believed that music could directly touch the soul or self, deeply influencing the character while bypassing reason. Quote, "Because more than anything else, rhythm and harmony find their way into the inmost soul and take strongest hold upon it." He also described music as, quote, "a moral law. It gives soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and charm and gaiety to life and to everything." He believed music had the power to shape the character, but it could shape one for good or for evil. Therefore, he claimed there were right and wrong kinds of music. Plato is using his reason to understand a moral utility for music. Similar beliefs to Plato's carried through the centuries. In the 4th and 5th centuries, many prominent thinkers, such as St. Augustine, believed music affected the soul and thus could influence and determine the ethics, actions, and morals of individuals. The common belief was that the mind couldn't always reliably control our senses and deepest desires, and because of that, they believed differentiation of emotions was dangerous. The Renaissance period would introduce the idea that music was not directly related to celestial bodies, but to the listener. Johannes de Gracchio, whose work criticized Pythagoras, Plato, and Boethius, stated, "Songs for average people relate to the deeds of heroes, the life and martyrdom of various saints, the battles. Songs for kings and princes move their souls to audacity and bravery, magnanimity and liberality." This introduces the idea that music would make different people feel different emotions, and this philosophical change births the music of the 15th through the 19th centuries, where artists would intentionally aim to appeal to musical emotions. Emotional tension and release in music were explored through tonal music, yielding what we now call cadence. This musical exploration via tension and release even inspired composers to imitate speech through music. This growing sophistication in musical expression also encouraged richer subject matter of the text associated with that music. These advancements would eventually converge into the invention of opera at the end of the 16th century. Monteverdi, one of the earliest opera writers and composer of the earliest preserved opera, Orfeo, was greatly pivotal in this new evolution of music. A detractor wrote of Monteverdi's work and of others of his ilk, "The words are to be the mistress of the harmony and not its servant." This cultural maturation of evolving stage plays with music included into this new art form of opera was profound. And the heart of this description, "words are to be the mistress of the harmony," was a guiding star during the Baroque period. In the 17th century, French philosopher René Descartes' ideas of the underlying bodily processes that determined the passions greatly impacted how art was made. Descartes' theory prompted German composer Johann Mattheson to refine a theory of emotions in music called the doctrine of affections. Descartes and Mattheson understood emotions as monolithic, which eventually turned opera into a series of songs, each aiming for a specific emotion, moving away from Monteverdi's ideas of combining text, music, and drama seamlessly. Some essential part of the freedom of music was lost. It was similar to a kind of musical puritanism like the ancient Greeks and early church fathers. Instead of trying to remain pure in mind and soul like them, this period was defined by purity of impact. But the 18th century would see a reform back to Monteverdi's vision. Composers realized you didn't have to think of emotions as a monolithic, singular object. You could have music be a differentiated and blending expression of emotion. This blending of emotion could create brand new emotions. In those days, philosophers and scientists had not separated the difference between a concept model and emotions in the brain. This is why through the Baroque period, much of the art was very imitative. They were to impart a specific emotion to the listener, and in some cases, act as a petition or offering to the spiritual. Considering musical contents can't be adequately expressed in words, music can never perfectly imitate something specific. Thomas Twining, an English merchant you may recognize as the namesake for Twinings Tea Company, actually made some interesting observations about this. Twining wrote in 1789, quote, "The notion that painting, poetry, and music are all arts of imitation certainly tend to produce and has produced much confusion, and instead of producing order and method in our ideas, produce only embarrassment and confusion." As technology advanced further along with art, we started to have a better scientific understanding of music as sound. In the 19th century, German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz analyzed the physics of why specific intervals of notes were more pleasing to the ear. Without spending too much time on this, because there is a lot here, he understood sound as vibrations through air, producing a fundamental frequency and overtones. Mathematically, how the overtones of two or more pitches interact with each other could either be more consonant, that is, whole and harmonious, or dissonant, clashing and dense. It was through this method he was able to mathematically explain why we used the scales that we do, why the West uses 12 tones, and why instruments being out of tune with each other can sound quite unpleasant. Helmholtz's acoustic theory was a major step in the advancement of understanding music, though there is obviously a difference between how consonant two pitches sound together and how we experience aesthetic beauty in music. Patterns of consonance and dissonance in structure is what allows a composer to elicit a great variety of aesthetic emotions. There is currently a movement of people out there claiming, quote, "Music is all relative," and I'm not so sure most of them understand how they could be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Recent laboratory experiments have confirmed that musical harmony is based on inborn human mechanisms. Babies 2 days old prefer consonant sounds over dissonance. Evolutionary biologists believe this is linked to mechanisms used to distinguish the voice emotionality. More consonant sounds like speech are pleasing. Some may call it the melody of voice. But vocal sounds of distress, like being attacked or being burned, are more dissonant. Evolutionary biologists also believe the connection between voice sounds and states of soul has been a trait of our ancestors well before we ever developed language. But we'll dive further into that concept later. There are far more objective elements to music than most people give it credit for. While interpretation can vary from listener to listener, there are almost always far more areas of agreement of interpretation than there are differences. Now, when I say interpretation in this case, I mean from communication theory, like decoding. I don't mean interpretation as artistic meaning, but because we emphasize the differences of interpretation, primarily through our personal enjoyment of the art, we can easily lose sight of the aspects that are objectively true about the music. Yes, even the emotions experienced. Throughout history, man has had a wide variety of theories about music. But what are the theories of music and emotion today? Even though Perlovsky highlights specific theories that are all built off of one another and point right to where we are today, there were many competing theories about music throughout history, and today there are still many theories about music that contradict one another. Let's take a quick peek at one of these psychological perspectives for explaining music. Quoting a summary from Vempala and Russo, quote, "There are two positions in the classic debate regarding musical emotion, the cognitivist position and the emotivist position. According to the cognitivist position, music expresses emotion but does not induce it in listeners. So listeners may recognize emotion in music without feeling it, unlike real everyday emotion. According to the emotivist position, listeners not only recognize emotion, but also feel it. This is supported by their physiological responses during music listening, which are similar to responses occurring with real emotion. When listeners provide emotion appraisals, if the cognitivist position were true, then these appraisals might be based on audio features in the music. However, if the emotivist position were true, then appraisals would be based on the emotion experienced by listeners as opposed to what they perceived in the audio features. I put myself more in the emotivist camp, and I imagine Perlovsky is as well. How can one identify an emotion if they aren't experiencing it? I can understand that if someone were listening to a song about being happy, we might even call this song Happy by Pharrell Williams, and they become irritated or agitated by listening to it. But as you'll come to see, emotions, especially aesthetic emotions, are incredibly complex. We can hold multiple contradicting emotions at once. This can produce an emotional dissonance and irritation in listeners. Next, let's look at the evolutionary perspective. While scientists agree that music is solely a human quality, both in creation and experience, identifying which selection pressures produced music is still difficult. Josh McDermott, psychological researcher and associate professor at MIT, writes, quote, "Music is a universal, a significant feature of every known culture, and yet does not serve an obvious, uncontroversial function." Laurel Trainer, professor of psychology and neurosciences at McMaster's University, believes higher cognitive functions like music are difficult to account for in evolution. We still don't know enough to determine whether music is an adaptation or an exaptation. What do these words mean? In evolutionary theory, an adaptation is a trait selected to adapt to a specific environmental pressure. For instance, it's believed birds evolved feathers to protect themselves from the cold. Temperature regulation was the reason for the adaptation of feathers in birds. The uses of feathers that we're more familiar with in birds, like feathers being used for flying or mate attraction, are exaptations. The feathers evolved as a dominant trait for one reason, that is, temperature regulation, but shifted function as time progressed for a secondary reason, like flying or mate attraction. That is the exaptation. So Trainer posits that music has to be an evolved survival mechanism to qualify as an adaptation. She believes music evolved from auditory scene analysis, but admits the origins of music are still extremely complex. Perlovsky's theory does provide evidence and explanation for music being an adaptation, not an exaptation. While the literature mentioned above does great work and makes some great observations and progress, Perlovsky's theory on music evolving to resolve cognitive dissonances is very strong and will most likely change how you perceive music from now on. But back to the other current theories. David Hurin, professor of music and faculty of the Cognitive Science Department at Ohio State University, expands further upon Trainer's observations. He says if we want to find the evolutionary origins of music, we need to see the complex, multi-stage adaptations over time. He lists many possible survival advantages of music, such as mate selection, social cohesion, the coordination of group work, conflict resolution, preserving stories. But Hurin acknowledges while all of these look promising on the surface, none of these explain the complete power music has over the mind, why it engages the whole psyche. It doesn't relate musical emotions to fundamental mechanisms of the mind. We'll be explaining those fundamental mechanisms in a later video and relate them to Perlovsky's theory. Ian Cross, professor of music and science at Cambridge University, came upon a stunning find that's a major key point in Perlovsky's theory and truly unlocks why music and language have so many overlaps. Cross says a strong argument for music being evolutionary is how it's found in every culture throughout all time across the globe, going so far as to say music is necessary for the development of culture. Furthermore, music has common attributes and uses across cultures. Cross then determines music must have evolved from cognitive aspects already existing in the animal kingdom. The most significant finding was Cross's connection of music and language as means of communication within culture. This is about to get very dense, but I will do my best to explain it after we go through it. Cross says, quote, "Music and language constitute complementary components of the human communicative toolkit." Or, music and language are both essential parts of how humans communicate with each other, and they complement one another. Remember when we talked about the musicality of the voice? The word for this is prosody, or the melodic qualities found in a person's natural speaking voice. And remember when we mentioned how words can bring greater context to music? If you would listen to a song called "I Can't Decide" by the Scissor Sisters but had no vocals on it, you'd probably assume it's another happy-go-lucky 70s rock tune. Then you incorporate the lyrics of a psychopathic serial killer, and the music takes on new meaning and elicits different emotions. The happy, fun emotions of the music, without any of the lyrical meaning, are still pumping into you. But the dissonance of those happy emotions against now these dark emotions of the context of the lyrics elicits a third new emotion, dementedness. This is how language can enhance the emotional experience of a non-semantic piece of music. Music and language are inextricably linked, and Cross goes further. The power of language is in its concreteness. On one hand, this enabled the exchange of specific and complicated information, but it could emphasize the differences between two individuals' goals, turning an unknown encounter into a conflict. Music is a communicative tool with opposite properties to language. He says music's major role, quote, "is social. It serves as an honest signal, or in communication theory terms, it reveals the qualities of the sender to the receiver. This honest signal has, quote, non-specific goals. The indeterminacy of meaning or floating intentionality," end quote, allows for individuals to interact and not come into conflict, while having different goals and meanings. Okay, that's hard to digest, I acknowledge. And frankly, I'm not even sure exactly how to interpret it without going back through that whole paper myself. It appears as though Cross is pointing to the fact that music seems to be a part of life that brings people together. It helps social cohesion around commonality, even when the individuals involved in the musical experience will have different ideas or goals that may conflict with one another. Cross says that successfully living in societies was the evolutionary pressure that forced this musical adaptation. If people were going to continue living together, they needed to get along. Thus, music was born to unite them. He suggests that music and language evolved together, parallel and simultaneously. Humans adapting language required a rewiring of the neural control over the vocal tract. If humans had to make such specific sounds of great variety, we needed much stronger voluntary control over our voices. Yes, when your cat meows or your dog barks, they do not have remotely the sophistication of control over their voices we do, nor the same level of intention. They do not have voluntary language as we humans understand it. Language is something we voluntarily craft as a means to communicate specific ideas. Language is not a yelp after you burn yourself or a scream if something frightens you, the involuntary vocalizations. Proto-humans only had this less voluntary vocalization method as well. The music and language portions were more seamlessly integrated with one another, making communication about complex thoughts difficult or impossible, but maintaining that honest signal that Cross had mentioned before. As language evolved and got more complex and more specific and more defined, that honest signal was going to be lost in language and needed to be maintained. Thus, a second communication tool was born, and it became much less semantic and became music. As far as I understand it, it didn't happen exactly that way. It wasn't language, then music. It was indeed both of them at the same time. This idea of proto-humans having a more integrated form of vocal communication seems to be supported by how social primates interact with one another. When raising their young, part of the play the adults will do with juveniles has proto-musical features to it. Even in humans still to this day, Infant-directed speech, or IDS, or what we would call baby talk, has stronger musical qualities and speech patterns than normal everyday speech. Infants are extremely sensitive to musical structures in the voice, and IDS is a constant across cultures throughout history. This more musical baby talk is important for the healthy development of a baby. Again, this is not absolute proof, but some good support. Taking a quick turn back to psychology, some of you may be familiar with the GEMS scale, or the Geneva Emotive Music Scale, introduced by, I'm not reading those names, I'm sorry, introduced by those guys in 2008. This scale measures emotional response to music over 45 different emotion types. For the time, this was a great step forward in understanding music emotions and preference. But Perlovsky believes GEMS is still insufficient. First, GEMS only uses 45 different emotions, where there are about 150 different words used to express emotion in the English language. Second, music evolved to liberate itself from the semantic, so trying to wrap words around it will inevitably be inadequate. Personally, I'm not so sure if I fully agree with Perlovsky on this point, but it is a fair point. And lastly, as Perlovsky will explain, there are thousands of musical emotions humans can experience that have no specific words to identify them. Crazy, I know, but like I said, we'll touch on this in a further video. Perlovsky believes while most of these studies have important contributions to better understanding music, they are still, quote, lacking and unconvincing. Why do we need the virtual infinity of musical emotions? Is it an aberration? Or do these emotions address potentially universal human needs? To help clarify a bit, when Perlovsky says musical emotions, I'm pretty sure he's referring to the unique blend of emotions human beings feel when engaging with music. The unique blends and layers of emotions can be seemingly infinite. Some of these emotional layers can be so subtle, they may be hard to put words to, or you may not even notice them. When you listen to the recording of Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles, you feel one particular blend of emotions. When you listen to Eleanor Rigby covered by Goran Solskjaer, it's a different blend of emotions that you're feeling. There are many commonalities between the two. The chords and the melody are the same, the feel and rhythmic structure is mostly the same, but the arrangement and key are different. While we can recognize, hey, that's Eleanor Rigby, the emotional experiences are not directly interchangeable. I think this is a demonstration of what Perlovsky means by, quote, virtual infinity of musical emotions. As you can see, man has always been fascinated with music. Regardless of how much we learn about music, it still elicits that spiritual, supernatural feeling, like we've been blessed to touch God. And much like God, it seems the more we try to define music, the further we get away from an answer. Can we map music meaning? Perlovsky seems to believe so. And in the next video, we'll explore some of the mechanisms of the mind, like concepts, instincts, emotions, and behavior that will provide some road signs on our way to mapping meaning. While it won't be quite as music-focused as other videos, it's exceedingly important groundwork to understanding Perlovsky's theory and better understanding where we derive meaning from and how we derive meaning from music. I love you all. Thank you.